And we're live. I'm just gonna put myself on mute now.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second anti-racism online session hosted by the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion. I hope everyone is staying safe and adhering to physical distancing measures. Would like to start tonight's session in a different way. As many of you know, the practice of having land acknowledgements read or spoken at events before things begin is a mode of operation. But today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share some information about the Yellowhead Institute. The Yellowhead Institute is a First Nations led research think tank that is based in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University in Toronto. They are involved in providing policy notions for government and information about the work that many Indigenous nations and communities are doing to address settler colonization here on this land. So I will encourage our listeners and those that are out there to check out their website, Yellowhead Institute, and support in whichever way you can. And that is our actionable way of addressing settler colonization here on this land. I'm excited to have Huda, Hassan, and Lynn who will be talking about solidarity in the wake of COVID-19, challenging xenophobia, anti-Black racism, and global capitalism. So I would like to hand it over to Huda and Lynn, and I'll be back for the question and answer period. And again, would like to, before I let Huda start eagerly ready to go, would like to thank our sponsors, Canadian Heritage, for providing funding to undertake this anti-racism conference, Rabble Media, YWCA Hamilton, the Hamilton Immigration Partnership Council, and the Sexual Assault Center for Hamilton and area. Huda, I pass it over to you.
Thank you, Kojo. Welcome, everyone. I don't know who's here. I cannot see who's the audience right now. I can only see Lynn and our ASL interpreters. Welcome, though. I hope that today we'll have a really fruitful conversation. I wanted to start by saying thank you to Kojo, Sarah, and Mohammed, and the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion for hosting the space and finding new ways for us to continue on this conversation. I know that this was intended to be an in-person conference in the month of March, but of course, COVID-19 has interrupted all of our lives and all of our plans for a month. I want to thank, sponsors and folks who contribute to this conversation, such as Rabble.ca and OCASI and Canadian Heritage. And more importantly, I would like to also thank Lynn for graciously agreeing to be part of this conversation and helping me or collectively redirecting the direction of where this conversation was going to go. The intention was originally a month ago or 2 months ago on my end to talk about anti-Black racism in Canadian news media, but considering the world that we're living in right now, it makes a lot more sense to have a very frank and honest conversation about xenophobia, anti-Black racism, or discrimination altogether in the wake of COVID and how global capitalism is shaping that. So thank you, Lynn, for agreeing to this.
No, thank you. I'm so honored to have this conversation with you, honestly. We've been obviously talking already, and so there were a few points that we wanted to hit. So I guess why don't we just get into it? And let's begin maybe with positioning ourselves and reflecting on what this conversation means to us as colleagues, as friends.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to add, as people, on the stolen lands of Indigenous people, including, Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, but also as people, coming from different experiences of white supremacy, of queer transphobia, and colonialism ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So I guess my question to us is why are these conversations across racial difference important right now, and what makes them difficult to have?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm arriving at this conversation with the hopes of both you and I meeting each other where we're at in this moment, and having a pretty frank and honest conversation about how colonialism and global capitalism continues to shape our lives and our communities' lives, and to honestly think through what mutual care and solidarity can look like for East Asian and Black communities right now, because I don't think that is a relationship, which we will explore today, that has the strongest solidarity practices or connections with one another. Yes. I do love that this conversation is happening between you and I, because we've known each other for 5 years now, and we both know each other from academia, from being in the same department at U of T, where we both research and write and read about and think about and talk a lot about power. And too much. But what I do love about how our work bridges into our friendship and our relationship is that I think both you and I try our best to think through how we live through power and how we impose power and how we evoke power, and try to honestly reflect on it. And I think that's really important for any sort of attempts at solidarity or community building or community building. One thing I have been thinking a lot about recently is a tweet that I told you about by C. Riley Smartin,
right.
Who I'm sure we've both read several times at school. When COVID was when the global pandemic was announced and becoming very clearly a central component of our collective lives for the months to come, he tweeted, I quote, "Exposure to the virus is not a great equalizer. Rather, COVID exposes the uneven life chances that constitute the collectivities we have already been part of." So I think that's how we're arriving at this conversation, thinking through the ways in which power and history and colonialism in particular, or settler colonialism, shapes the varying experiences within this pandemic. Mm-hmm. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is mass grief, how much grief is taking place right now. And for the first time in a long time, a lot of us globally are enduring a sudden and unexpected shift, and we're experiencing that collectively. Right. But there are also differences within that too, right? I'm thinking a lot lately about the familiarity of grief for particular communities, particularly refugees and Black and Indigenous people who are subjected to difficulties around mobility and surveillance and incarceration, and also overexposure to death. What about you? Where are you at?
Where am I at? I'm really hoping this conversation will be an opportunity to witness each other, to witness COVID together. I think what makes this conversation so difficult, and solidarity conversations so difficult between Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, is the fact that the co-constitution of our histories is not really valued in the academy. We spend like a lot of our energy and time talking about our relationship to whiteness, to settlers, to colonialism. And so what makes me almost anxious in these types of conversations is the fact that I know that I don't know a lot about our histories together, right? And the entangled ways, and sometimes beautiful and sometimes violent ways Asian and Black communities have historically interacted together. Just because, as marginalized people, we make really difficult, brutal decisions about how to handle our own dehumanization. Right. And oftentimes our articulations of freedom are complicit in the oppression of others. Right. And so, to be honest, I am scared. I am scared because I don't want to say something fucked up to you, quite frankly. Because I really value our relationship as colleagues and as friends. Mm-hmm. And in that way, I'm really grateful that we're approaching this as friends and having this conversation as friends. Because I think we have been in the practice of extending some patience and generosity to each other, when we make mistakes, and sometimes that happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do think that, our fuck ups are also great learning points as well too, or great center points or entry points into learning and having difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Ideally with less harm or no harm.
Right.
But very Scorpio of me, but I say walk into the fuck ups.
I love it. I'm an Aries, so let's go. Let's go into the fire.
Let's do it. So I kind of want to start this conversation with, I want to think through, there's so much stuff that we could talk about when it comes to, East Asian discrimination or discrimination towards East Asian and South Asian communities and anti-Black racism. But I kind of want to start by thinking through contagion and diseases and the colonial history of associating contagious diseases with Asians, but also colonized subjects. How is COVID-19 evoking a history or a presence of racializing contagion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think earlier in the year, at the beginning of this, when people were calling it a Chinese virus, by people I mean Trump, and calling it the Wuhan virus or whatever, immediately I was like, oh man, this is going to be worse than SARS. Because SARS was a similar thing, right, with the racialization of Asian people. Except now I think we're in a context where white supremacist, fascist, alt-right movements, or white settler state isolationism has been building for a while. And just before this, we were, the way China made it into the news was through a trade war. Yeah. And so I knew my first reaction was, this is going to be worse. And of course that's pulling from a history that is much earlier than SARS, right? Mm-hmm. That comes from just the origins of how settler states have treated, Chinatown as a place of, disease and pathology, especially venereal disease, and how that was always a threat to white domesticity. And so associating Asians with contagion, their cultural practices, especially Asian food is really politicized in this context, and in general, right? And how those practices are made to seem counter to modernity and counter to so-called sanitary public health conditions. So that was my immediate thought. But I also, and we talked about this before, I also thought about in recent years Zika and Ebola, right? And those were racialized African and Black, right? And I think sometimes that really gets lost in the ways Orientalism is rehearsed, in the ways in which we recall Asian North American history. And that has to do with, liberal and multicultural frameworks of how these histories are really bounded. We have Asian American studies over here. We have, Black media studies over there. So that was sort of my second reaction, to say that actually the racialization of disease, it doesn't just happen to Asian people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's actively been a tool of subjugating and further colonizing Indigenous people, and also enslaving and colonizing Black people as well too.
Exactly.
What's the link between colonialism and settler colonialism and the expansion of public health as like a surveillance tool or like a population control technology?
I mean, it's exactly that, right? Under the name of safety, by safety, oftentimes we mean, white domestic spaces, the safety of those areas, right? And making sure the contagion doesn't infiltrate. Under that name, there's, the tracking of bodies, where they're moving, what they're doing, who they're having sex with, where they're living, the control of property, and all of that all comes under the name of public health. And the oftentimes the answer that historically is given to public health concerns and epidemics is, the language of containment, right, policing, surveillance. Mm-hmm. That isn't new, and it seems like we're heading to that again.
Right. Yeah, I definitely want to add to the way that COVID-19, the one alarming thing that COVID-19 is doing is building this relationship, an ongoing relationship, but building a relationship between the public health system and policing. And that is effectively being used to recategorize Black people as difficult to control, as wayward. There's a really excellent article that I would recommend folks in the audience to read on theconversation.com called "Coronavirus Discriminates Against Black Lives Through Surveillance, Policing, and the Absence of Health Data." That working through that article definitely made me think through the ways in which the different medical and social responses to Black people and undocumented citizens, a reality that's always present, but particularly present right now in the midst of this pandemic. Public health, there's evidence of this, has continuously been used as a weapon. And it's been used as a weapon, a white supremacist weapon, against subjugated communities. And we've seen examples of this here in Canada, for instance, with Africville. Mm-hmm. Africville, which is people were failed by the state of Halifax, or actively neglected by the state of Halifax. They were failed very basic infrastructure and services like roads, water, sewage, and it was a location where there sites where there was a building of a waste treatment facility nearby in the 20th century, and that led to the residents of Africville struggling with poverty and poor health conditions, deteriorating community buildings, which inevitably led to the demolition of a historically Black location. Smallpox in Louisiana in 1866, post-emancipation, is another example of the ways in which public health actively, intentionally failed Black people. And
sorry, where was that?
In Louisiana in 1866, post-emancipation. Yeah. There was a reframing. There's an outbreak of smallpox that was 100% a result of a failure of public health, and a way to destruct and erase an undesired community. And in Canada, we talked about this earlier, or across North America, we obviously see this with Indigenous communities. There's a way that public health actively fails anyone who is undesired by the state.
Right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, I think the point that I want to emphasize is that public health, since its inception, has always been an extension of policing Black and Indigenous peoples and other racialized peoples, and has been a strategic tool of surveilling our actions and our movements, just like you said. And during COVID, it's actively leading to Black people getting arrested, detained, in physical conflict with police. We're seeing this in Ottawa. We saw this in Brampton recently. We're definitely seeing it in the United States, or it leading also to the murder of Black people in Canada and the US. Right. And all this is being framed for the sake of public health. So exactly. One thing that I think I would compel people to think about right now is, who is public health for, and who does public health be about?
Right. I like the way you brought in sort of Indigenous histories along with Black histories, because oftentimes I think that conversation has really built up in the past decade in the academy, and
activism and
and activism, and we don't hear as much about sort of the entanglements between Asian and Black communities, right? And so I guess what I wanted to lead us to our next topic of entanglement and thinking through Asian and Black encounters in the Americas and beyond. So I guess what are the various frictions and violences between Black and Asian communities? The myth of our separateness, or boundedness. What are the ways you're sort of seeing these entanglements, especially in the form of anti-Blackness in Asian contexts?
Right. I mean, you and I talked about this, and I hope that maybe if there are folks in the audience who want to chime in on this during the question and answer period, who can potentially inform us. But I feel like you and I definitely concluded that, there's not really a relationship between East Asians and Black communities here or in North America, or that there's not a lot of strong evidence of any sort of solidarity building or like mutual care or like community practices.
There's some signs sometimes. Usually some students, being like, Asians for Black Lives Matter. We're a small contingent, but we're there. We're trying.
I don't think that relationship's that strong, though. Especially in Canada. But one thing I think is important for us to think about too is also how East Asians are complicit in anti-Black racism. We have seen various frictions and violences between Black and Asian communities, especially when we take this conversation outside of where we're situated and we think about global capitalism. We're talking about contagion and the racialization of diseases. Right now I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this city, Guangzhou in China. this has been all over the news, and I think this information is pretty accessible, but
Yeah.
COVID-19 is now being re-racialized as an African disease in China and is being used as an excuse or as a justification in ongoing anti-Black, the ongoing anti-Black project that stems out of China, a growing global empire. And this is leading to Black people or Africans being barred from establishments. They're being evicted from their homes. Black people are now being forced into homelessness. And in the midst of that, there is this promise that is being given from China to several African states that they are trying to address this issue, which I think is completely a strategic response if we think about neocolonialism and China's economic or colonial relationship with African economies. Africa, we were talking about this earlier, but Africa is definitely a very resourceful place. It's a resource-rich or dense location. And arguably, West Africa is one of the most resourceful places globally. None of that is owned by Africans. That's owned by China, the state. And I think that we need to think about how racial capitalism plays into the layers of racism and discrimination that's happening with COVID-19 right now, right? Like racial capitalism has always depended on or operated off of Black labor and bondage and the resources of Black people and Black places. But I bring this back to North America. The difficulty with what's happening right now is that there is rightfully more awareness about anti-East Asian hate crimes. That's definitely emerging right now. I think I saw a Guardian article saying something about there's a 21% increase in East Asian hate crimes. And that is a reality that needs to be addressed and is a concern of mine and should be of others. What is also a very big concern of mine is that who's dying from this disease? It's Black people. Who's at the forefront of this disease right now? It's Black people. Who are the essential workers, and how do class and racial disparities shape who is at the forefront of confronting this disease? The numbers are there, or the proof is there for the US and the UK. Unfortunately, we live in a country that fails to provide any sort of racial data or race-based data on anything.
Right. Yes.
But we can make the assumption that the experiences here are very parallel to the US and Canada, or the US and the UK as well too. But Black people are alarmingly disproportionately dying from COVID-19.
Right.
And that's because of anti-Black medical racism. And that's also being compounded with everyday public policing and hypersurveillance and racial and class disparities. And I think what we're trying to evoke in this conversation about possibilities of solidarity between East Asian communities and Black communities, there needs to be a better understanding of the different levels of racism and colonialism and the ways in which everyday individual events is not really comparable to structural racism.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You brought up a lot there. I think bringing up China and Cold War formations we'll talk about later, especially like the Cold War and Orientalism kind of makes us think about how places like China are like the opposite or posting force of the US, when really in terms of, a surveillance culture, in terms of anti-Blackness, in terms of the exploitation of marginalized and poor people, Asia is really one of those big contexts that globalizes anti-Blackness, right? And that speaks to not only their relationship with Africa, but also, and I think this can be sort of a bridge for Black people and maybe the crazy broke Asian side of things. And that's I said it. And that's the fact that, colorism and shadism is already internal to Asia and Asians. And there's already that impulse there. Asia is one of the biggest consumers of whitening creams. That's what we're talking about here. And in terms of North America, and especially I think Asian American activism around COVID at this point in time, I'm seeing a lot of the language that they're using is hate crimes. I think the hashtag wash don't hate or something. Wash not hate.
Wash the hate.
Wash the hate. Wash the hate. Wash the hate.
Just such a weird.
There's so many things we could talk about that, but I think one thing that we know about, and this is not to delegitimize the real fear that Asian people are having going into public spaces right now, but it is to say that I'm hesitant and a bit worried about that language of hate crimes. Not only is it like an interpersonal way of politicizing COVID for Asian Americans, but I think we know from the past decade of LGBT mobilizations of anti hate crimes and legislation coincided with like one of the biggest military budgets ever, and it coincided with Islamophobia and the war on terror and how those places were, insufficiently LGBT friendly. And that was sort of like the justification for war. And so mobilizing around hate crimes, and I'm not saying that all of them do this. I think a lot of communities are self-reporting and collecting their own data, not for the state, but for themselves, and talking about transformative justice. But I do want to sort of caution that with the fact that hate crimes really mobilizes increased calls for surveillance, policing, and carcerality, right? The videos that I'm seeing anyways in my, algorithm of social media, because we know algorithms are also, racist, right? The videos that I've seen that are going viral are the ones where perpetrators are working class and or Black or other racialized folks, right? And so, and there's this idea that, or yes, the resilient xenophobic idea that, Asians are perpetually foreign and, bring with them these, dangerous diseases, has led, Asian political leaders like former presidential candidate Andrew Yang to encourage Asians to show, their patriotism, right? To show their model conduct of washing their hands. They're upstanding citizens that don't deserve this, right? And of course, that discourse is really dependent on the state as a source of resolution, the nation state as the source of security and safety, when we know from, critiques by Indigenous people, Black people, but also, Asian people, that this state is what's complicit in and what mobilizes the unworthy citizens into jails, into detention centers, into conditions that lead to premature death. And so that's where I see sort of the problem with that, and I actually would link that to LGBT movements in the past decade, and how hate crimes really, despite the intention behind it, oftentimes is used to justify more military, more weapons, more jails as the answer, to safety, right?
Right. You just hit like a lot of amazing points. I know we only have about like 7 minutes left.
Oh no!
But I kind of want to probe you a little bit more. I know we have 2 other things that we want to talk about. But I want to talk about empires. I want to talk about emergence of new empires. And for like those who are watching, because we were thinking about this before the talk, how to define empire. And Lynn, please chime in on this, because I wrote chicken scratch on my notes. But I'm thinking about empire in terms of global power and in relation to capital,
Yes.
money, in relation to cultural and political hegemony. Just basically global dominance or global weight. Are you there? Oh, you froze. Okay. Lynn has froze, so I'm going to continue talking. Oh, is she?
Hello.
Lynn? Can you guys see her? Okay, we can hear your voice, so just keep talking if that's cool.
Oh no.
We can hear you, Lynn.
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. So I'm just going to move forward with the question then, if that's cool. Oh, and Lynn disappeared.
I think she got disconnected. Oh, she's back in.
Oh, she's back in. Okay. I'm going to continue on with the question. I assume and hope that Lynn can hear this. But I guess for the audience, at least, I think that part of this conversation, because we are talking about global capitalism as well, I think that I'm definitely interested in talking and thinking through more about China as a growing empire or a new global hegemon. And this is Lynn, are you there? Ooh. This is part of Lynn's work as well too, and their research. There. Okay, unmute yourself. You're on mute.
Hello?
Hey, I can hear you.
Oh my god, now it just looks like I was running away from that empire definition question.
It's okay. I quickly tried to define it. We can move on. But I do want to ask you, we understand global empires. Like when we think of global empires, I think I would imagine initially many of us would think of the United States. And that is accurate, but I think that there's a complication. We can complicate that a little bit more. And I think that the Cold War was very instrumental in shaping a triangulation, I guess, of global power, where it was the emergence or the defining of the U.S. Or the U.S. as the West and as this global empire, and versus the Third World, but also the rise of the communist East. So I guess I'm asking you, how has the Cold War, how was the Cold War instrumental in shaping global empires, but also competing empires and the militarization of empires? And
Right.
How are those struggles related to Turtle Island, where we're at?
Right. That's a huge question.
I know, sorry. I literally heard myself and I'm like, girl.
But I'll try. And I think we can even, the language of empire is really important here, because I think we can answer that question with and without the Cold War. And we can, if we're talking about post-New World racial formation here, China, xenophobia has like a very particular role. And we can go, way back to Columbus and Co. Columbus and Co. Inaugurating the project of genocide and conquest in the Americas because, and this is often left out in the story, because he was looking for a new trade route to China, right? And there was like worry about the Islamic Ottoman Empire as a competing force. Mm-hmm. And so shout out to Elliot June, by the way, for that. His work deals with that. But, going towards the Cold War, where communism was seen as the virus, right? And, the so-called loss of China to communism in the mid-20th century, and how that basically produced huge military and police intervention in Korea and eventually Vietnam, right? Because the discourse was there to contain, communism and stop it from spreading to other Asian countries. Yeah. And what we know from Asian scholars and Asian critique here is that posed a huge, violent problem, not just for previously colonized and subjugated Asians, right? Like Southeast Asians in Korea, we're talking about decolonial movements against Japan, right? Not only for them, but militarization requires a lot of land, a lot of resources, and a lot of precarious soldiers willing to give their life to this project, right? And so xenophobia, or sometimes xenophilia, right? Xenophilia, sort of like an admiration of China, or a willingness to really capitalize on China's huge population as like a consumer market, that sort of thing. What that elides, or what that masks, is the huge capital and military buildup across the Pacific that the U.S. performed in order to combat China as an emerging empire, right? And so when we talk about xenophobia, we're also talking about the dangers of mobilizing a U.S. nation-building project, right? Where we know the military recruits vulnerable people because, people want to get healthcare or college education and sign up for the military across the U.S., empire of military bases across the Pacific, endangering Indigenous people, Native Pacific Islanders, Black queer people who are disproportionately at the front lines of wars, endangering their lives because, it's not like we're putting military bases at, High Park, right? Yeah. We're not storing Agent Orange in Wall Street or wherever. We're putting that on indigenous land. We're putting those dangerous factories in third world places. Right. So that's what I'll say about how anti-Asian sentiment and geopolitical forces play a role in settler colonialism in the Americas, across the Pacific, and anti-Blackness as well.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, because that is something I am still trying to learn more about too. But understanding how the Cold War is deeply connected to settler colonialism and like franchise colonialism and racial capitalism, the transatlantic slave trade. I see Kojo, so I think that can be to wrap up.
Wrap up. Okay.
I did want us to jump into our last.
Yes, I'll. I think this one's for you, and you can have the last word here.
We both can.
And that's, I'm thinking about, just before this, where, the Wet Sweat and Solidarity train blockades, right? So thinking about Yeah, Indigenous and Black movements like Standing Rock, I Don't Know More, Water Protectors, Black Lives Matter, as well as like the important political and theoretical work by other people of color, queer and trans people, have really led to different groups articulating the multiple and sometimes contradictory ways colonialism and the liberal nation state have foreclosed lives. So can we end with talking about how these movements help us think both about the interpersonal and the more structural relationships we have to power? Like how can these types of politics that these movements are forwarding produce possibilities for solidarity?
I'll try to do this like within 2 minutes.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. No, don't apologize. It's been an amazing conversation so far. But I do love that this conversation is like happening between you and I right now, and the communities that we're part of. You and I are both. You're from Vietnam, and I'm from Somalia, and we're both from pretty dominant refugee diasporas here in Canada. But I do love that we're having this conversation as two people in Toronto right now and trying to evoke a conversation about historical and contemporary examples we have of decolonial solidarity, which I don't think is practiced as much between our communities. But I do think we're living in a location where there are a lot of examples of it, or at least one very good example of it. And I do want to preface this by saying, actually, I'll say that point for later. But not too long ago, a few years ago, we in Toronto we witnessed BLM Tent City in 2016. And for those who are joining us from other locations or who might not be fully aware of that, but our chapter, Toronto's chapter of Black Lives Matter, occupied Toronto Police Service's headquarters in the early winter of 2016, after Andrew Loku, a local of ours, was murdered by Toronto police officers, and TPS decided that there would be no charges laid against his murderers. And I think that moment, that occupation, that experience was very instrumental in the ways in which Black and Indigenous community members were willing to show up for each other and to approach Black liberation struggles in a very anti-colonial way, with an understanding of how colonialism or settler colonialism has impacted these communities in similar but different ways, and arriving at their points of similarity to fight alongside each other. Right. Sandy Hudson, and because we don't have a lot of time to explore this a lot, I would recommend for people in the audience, if you're looking for further reading on this, Sandy Hudson, who is co-founder of BLM Toronto, has a really excellent piece a journal piece that she published in 2017. Let me find the title. Where's the title? The title is Indigenous and Black Solidarity in Practice. And she explores the ways that BLM had to reconcile with, or part of their strategizing of this occupation was to think through deeply how not to recolonize land and render Indigenous communities invisible. And that Indigenous communities were willing to show up and participate in that struggle to expose anti-Black murders by state forces. I don't want to evoke this as an example of a perfect relationship. I think there's a lot of things that are still ongoing and still things are still being worked through together. But I think that that's an excellent display of what solidarity can look like here, where we're at. And I think that there's a lot for our communities to learn, for several communities to learn from that moment. How can we exemplify, or how can we continue that work of solidarity that Black people in Toronto and Indigenous people in Toronto or on Turtle Island were able to evoke, with the understanding that our oppression, our struggles is very much shaped by the same people, the same. We share the same. We share the same enemy.
Right.
And I guess maybe I'm asking this question back to you, but I'm not. I don't think I'm an optimist. I think that I don't have categories, but I am essentially, for the most part, a pessimist. But I do think there's a possibility of replicating that type of solidarity between East Asians now in the wake of COVID and Black communities. Is that something that you think is a possibility, or do you think is necessary for that possibility to arrive?
Right. I am also kind of a pessimist. So, but I'm going to try to dare to hope. Because what I love about seeing or witnessing the social movements led by Indigenous and Black people is how expansive their framework is for thinking about freedom. And I think social movements in general are often misread as particular. Like, this issue only affects these people, right? And I see sort of like this bridge being made all the time between, let's say if we're thinking about Standing Rock and water protectors, right? And making that connection to Flint, right? Can we also make that connection of that critique of the sanctity of water and land? Can we also extend that to military pollution across military bases in Asia, across the Pacific? Can we think across those social movements? For instance, can queer critiques of the home extend to feminist critiques of abuse in families and homes and domestic violence, which can that extend to abusive conditions in prisons and detention centers and so forth? Because I think the strength in those movements, at least for someone outside of Indigenous and Black communities, is this critique that whether how a life based on polluted water or land, how a life based on containment, whether in abusive prison systems or abusive partnerships and homes, closed borders, extraction, global inequality, militarization, how all those things will never be enough to save anyone, let alone all of us, right? And so even if we don't fully understand each other's histories, even if we don't fully understand each other's emancipatory desires, can we involve each other in our articulations of freedom? And I think there's a possibility there, as there always was. But I think now, during a time of COVID, where we're seeing a lot of our relationships kind of being prevented in many ways, how can we imagine new relationships with each other? Just like from the ground up, type thing.
No, for sure. I love that. Thank you.
Sorry, we ended kind of late.
Yeah, sorry, Coach. Perfectly said.
No worries. I think this was a very deep conversation. We didn't have. I think our viewers didn't have questions because they were so enthralled with your discussions. So they were listening attentively. But I had one question for you before we kind of close out. I wanted to at least weave some threads that both of you mentioned. So the idea of decolonial solidarity, you talked about public health, you talked about reducing mobility for Black, Indigenous people of color, surveillance, exposure to death, right? So the last question that maybe can tie this bow up, because your title is Solidarity in the Wake of COVID. Many municipalities and the province and our federal government are now talking about recovery, and there hasn't been any discussions about reimagining and reconfiguring how colonization, settler colonialism affects the many communities that you gave examples of. So my question to both of you, and 1 minute each, or 1 minute and 30 seconds each, would be how can we reduce this fragmentation, right? Because I think at the core, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this realization that we are all connected together, right? But then now that the talk about reopening the economy has started, we are back to putting capital before people. We are back at putting business before people. We are back at the exploitative discussions, right? Here in Hamilton, the Water Watchers talk about water here, and then we find out that our city dumped 24 billion liters of sewage in the water, right? So how can we reduce that fragmentation, and how can we get together in a solidarity form that is actionable?
I will say that I think that we should think deeply about there is a recovery process that's happening right now, right? Like these states want to return back to normal life, aka they want to return back to a place where they could revive or save their economies, because there's a way that obviously COVID-19 has disrupted or interrupted capitalism. And I think that's deeply linked to, again, the conversation that we've been having about the value of human life and who is categorized as human, who is categorized as citizen, who is dying from this disease. I think now that we are aware of who is suffering and who is actually impacted by COVID-19, we were talking about this the other day, Lynn and I. These states are now recognizing it's Black people, it's racialized people, it's poor people, it's essential workers, it's people who suffer or experience racial and class disparities. Those are the people who are dying. Let's go back to normal life, because there is no value in that. And I think even the emergence of this global pandemic, like look at the locations that have suffered, or where the numbers have become alarmingly large or significant. Italy, the UK, the US. I think that's very much part of the response to COVID-19. But now that we realize, or that there's an understanding of who is dying in these locations because of COVID-19, there is a quick desire now to return or resurge or go back to regular life. Like let's get the economy going. Oh, Lynn's gone, so I guess that's the answer.
Oh, we lost Lynn.
Yeah.
Okay, so on behalf,
Are they back?
are they back?
Continue.
Oh, they're here. Lynn?
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, sorry.
Okay, so we'll let you answer, and then we'll wrap up.
No, it looks like I'm running away from all the hard questions here. I think there's a lot to learn about the movements that are unfolding before our eyes at this moment. And that's at the interpersonal level of, you know, calls to protect each other, calls to expose ourselves in the name of the safety of others. I think there's a lot to be learned from, a lot to learn from the various unionizing motions that are happening now that, you know, what was previously called unskilled labor is now being recognized as essential labor. And those are headed by people of color. And one example would be Somali women at Amazon, you know. I think there's so many possibilities there, and food delivery services unionizing, and so forth. I think what Huda was saying about how, you know, reopening the businesses, reopening the economy is happening now that we're kind of powerful people are maybe realizing who is dying from COVID. That's an important part there, because I think that shows us that anti-racist work can't stop at description. It can't stop at describing the numbers or rehearsing the statistics of who is vulnerable, because we already know that. And in fact, in maybe this political culture, that's the point. And so I think going towards grassroots movements again that are like really happening at this moment are already, you know, mobilizing cross-racially, across gender, with, you know, which it includes, you know, young working class white people, Black people, crazy broke Asians, and that sort of thing. I think it's happening now, is what I'm saying.
True.
Thank you very much. This conversation has been riveting, and like you said, anti-racism work doesn't stop at the statistics. We're definitely going to continue that work, continue that decolonial approach that Huda mentioned, and we hope that we'll be able to have you back again, have an in-person session, and yes, we can continue this discussion and the work in our communities together. So our time is up. We'd like to thank all the viewers that tuned in. We'd like to thank the ASL interpreters Annette and Vanessa for joining us and providing much needed interpretation to ensure that we don't leave anyone behind in these discussions. Our last word, we'd like to again thank all the sponsors, Canadian Heritage for providing funding for this conference, and Rabo Media, YWCA Hamilton, the Hamilton Immigration Partnership Council, the Sexual Assault Center for Hamilton and area, and Okasi. So we are back in 2 weeks, May 27th. We are finalizing the guest speakers. So please put the date in your calendar, May 27th. Again, on our social media platforms from 6 to 7. If you haven't signed up for our mailing list, you can go to our website, HCCI .ca, and sign up for our mailing list. And also, this work needs money, so you can always send a donation to HCCI via PayPal, paypal.me/Hamilton Civic. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Huda, Lynn. and we'll continue this discussion and continue this work. Everyone, have a great night.
Thank you, Kojo. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you.